Hello, my dear friends, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward, your host. You may know me from Warm Pages. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. What's the weather like where you are tonight? And do you have a little evening ritual that helps you unwind? Share it with us. I truly enjoy reading your comments. And don't forget to subscribe. Now, settle in. Our story begins. Chapter 1. The Bitter Wind and the Bad Sportsman. The fog rolled in from the Atlantic like an uninvited guest, thick and damp and determined to stay. It crept over the peaks of Sutherland, slithered down through the glens, and settled itself over the village of Lochdew with all the persistence of a Highland mist that knows its business. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood at the door of his Croft House police station, a tall, thin man with hazel eyes and red hair, watching the grey blanket descend upon his beloved village. He was not thinking about crime or duty or any of the things a proper police constable ought to be thinking about. He was thinking about his sheep. "Come on then," he said to the dog at his heels, a large beast with a fringe covering its eyes, and the mournful expression of a philosopher contemplating the futility of existence. "We'd best get the flock in before they wander off into this lot and end up in the next county." The dog, Lugs, wagged his tail in agreement. Inside the station, curled up on Hamish's second-best armchair, a large wild cat opened one yellow eye and closed it again. Swansea had no intention of venturing out into the wet. Hamish pulled on his regulation boots and headed out into the whiteness. The fog was so thick he could barely see 10 feet in front of him. It muffled sound and distorted distance, turning the familiar landscape into something otherworldly. He found his small flock huddled near the stone wall at the edge of his property, and began the gentle work of herding them toward shelter. It was while he was thus engaged in the pleasant avoidance of his official duties that he heard the roar of an expensive engine coming up the single-track road. The sound was wrong for Lochdew, too loud, too aggressive, too foreign to the gentle rhythms of Highland life. A Range Rover, gleaming and black and utterly out of place, came barrelling through the mist with a sort of confidence that suggested its driver had never met a road he did not own. It screeched to a halt outside the Lochdew Hotel, and a man emerged. He was perhaps 45, dressed in tweeds that were too new and too expensive, with the ruddy face of someone who drank too much of the good stuff and ate too much of the rich stuff. He had the bearing of a man who had learned early in life that shouting was more effective than listening. Hamish sighed. He recognised trouble when he saw it, even through the fog. By evening the entire village knew about Magnus Thorne. Bad news travelled faster than good in Lochdew, and Magnus Thorne was very bad news indeed. Hamish learned the details at the Lochdew Hotel, where he had repaired for a quiet drink after finally getting his sheep settled. The bar was fuller than usual, and the conversation was running hot despite the cold fog pressing against the windows. "Commercialise the hunt," spluttered Archie McLean, the local fisherman, his weathered face red with indignation. "Commercialise it? As if it was some sort of tourist attraction. My family's hunted those hills for 200 years. "Aye, and mine," said another voice. "And mine," said another. Magnus Thorne sat at the best table by the fire, drinking the hotel's finest whisky, and looking entirely pleased with himself. He had the expression of a cat who had not only got the cream, but had also managed to charge the other cats for the privilege of watching him drink it. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice booming across the small room, "I understand your sentimental attachment to tradition, but tradition does not pay the bills. The Laird's estate has modernised, and the autumn hunt will now be run on a proper commercial basis. There will be fees for access to the Old Drove Road, licences required for all hunting parties, and of course a nominal charge for use of the hills." "Nominal?" Archie McLean looked ready to explode. "You want to charge us for walking on land our grandfathers' grandfathers walked on for free." "I want to charge you for walking on private land," Thorne corrected smoothly. "There's quite a difference, legally speaking." The argument might have turned physical if a soft voice had not intervened. "Perhaps, Mr. Thorne, you might like some tea?" Mrs. Mary Sutherland stood in the doorway carrying a large basket. She was a woman of perhaps 50, small and neat, with grey hair pulled back in a modest bun and the gentle, apologetic air of someone who spent her life trying not to be a bother to anyone. She was the village librarian and a volunteer with the local heritage society. And she had the sort of quiet respectability that made even angry men lower their voices. Tea? Thorn looked at her as if she'd suggested hemlock. I thought it might help, Mary said softly. The mist brings such a chill. I've brought scones as well, fresh baked this afternoon. She moved through the room with the grace of long practice, setting out cups, pouring tea, offering scones with homemade jam. The angry voices subsided, replaced by the sounds of men eating and drinking and slowly remembering their manners. Hamish watched her with appreciation. Mary Sutherland was one of those rare people who could calm a storm with nothing more than good manners and baked goods. She had lived in Lochdoub for as long as he had been stationed there, a quiet presence in the library and the Heritage Centre, always ready with a helpful fact or a kind word. She caught his eye and smiled. I've brought some for you as well, Constable. I know how much you dislike the cold. You're very kind, Mrs. Sutherland, Hamish said, accepting a warm scone wrapped in a clean cloth. It's nothing, she said, her voice soft as always. We must all look after each other, especially when outsiders come bringing trouble. She said it so gently, so politely, that it took Hamish a moment to register the steel beneath the silk. But by then she'd moved on, offering more tea, more scones, more kindness. Magnus Thorn left the hotel an hour later, still full of himself, but somewhat mollified by the unexpected hospitality. The villagers dispersed, still angry, but no longer on the edge of violence. Hamish walked home through the fog with lugs at his heels, of the basket of scones in his hand and an uneasy feeling in his chest. Something about the evening felt wrong, though he could not quite put his finger on what. The fog pressed close around him, and somewhere in the hills a curlew called, its cry mournful and strange in the muffled air. Hamish Macbeth, who had excellent instincts about such things, shivered slightly and walked faster. The mist was thick as sheep's wool, and somewhere in its depths trouble was waiting. He just did not know yet how bad that trouble would be. Chapter 2. A Grim Discovery in the Mist. Hamish woke to the sound of shouting. This was unusual. Lochdoub was a village that believed in sleeping late and speaking softly, particularly on cold autumn mornings, when the sensible thing to do was to stay in bed for as long as humanly possible. He pulled on his clothes and went to the window. The fog had not lifted. If anything, it had grown thicker overnight, a solid wall of grey that turned the world into a watercolour painting left out in the rain. The shouting was coming from the direction of the moor. Hamish could make out figures moving through the whiteness, dark shapes that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. He pulled on his jacket and boots, grabbed his torch and headed out. Lugs followed, his tail at half-mast. The dog had excellent instincts about when a walk would be pleasant, and when it would involve dead bodies. This, his posture suggested, was likely to be the latter. The hunting party had gathered near the old Drove Road, a track that had been used for centuries to move cattle from the high pastures down to market. In the fog, the ancient standing stone that marked the crossroads looked like a giant keeping watch over the moor, and at the base of that stone lay Magnus Thorn. Hamish knew he was dead before he got close enough to check for a pulse. There was something about the angle of the body, the stillness of it, that spoke of a permanent departure from the concerns of the living. The back of Thorn's skull had been crushed. Beside the body lay the weapon, a heavy cast-iron implement that Hamish recognised immediately, although it was a tushkar, an antique peat cutter that had been part of the heritage display in the village library. The old tool was crusted with blood and hair. Nobody touch anything, Hamish said sharply, though the hunting party had already backed away from the corpse as if death might be contagious. Has anyone called Strathbane? Aye, said one of the beaters, a young man who looked ready to be sick. They're on their way. Hamish pulled out his mobile and took photographs of the scene. The fog made it difficult, but he documented what he could. The body, the weapon, the scuff marks in the heather, the position of everything. He noted that there were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds visible on Thorn's hands. The man had been struck from behind, swiftly and with considerable force. He also noted something else. Yet to reach this spot in the dark and the fog would have required intimate knowledge of the terrain. The moor was treacherous, full of hidden gullies and sudden drops. The killer had navigated it without a torch, which meant they knew every rock and hollow. That narrowed the suspects considerably. By the time Detective Chief Inspector Blair arrived from Strathbane, Hamish had secured the scene and taken statements from the hunting party. Blair emerged from his car like a bad-tempered toad, his fat face red with cold and irritation. "Macbeth," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I might have known you'd be involved in this." "Good morning to you too, sir," Hamish said mildly. "The body's over here." Blair stumped across the heather, breathing heavily. He was followed by Detective Inspector Jimmy Anderson, then a thin man with the haunted look of someone who spent too much time in Blair's company, and a forensics team from Strathbane. "Right," Blair said, looking down at the corpse with the expression of a man who had just been handed a particularly difficult crossword puzzle. "What do we know?" "Magnus Thorne," Hamish said. "Corporate sporting agent from London. Been in the village 2 days. Not popular." "I'll bet he wasn't," Blair said. "City type coming up here telling folks how to run their lives. Probably had it coming." "That's not exactly helpful, sir," Hamish said. "I'm not here to be helpful, Macbeth. I'm here to make an arrest." Blair's eyes gleamed. "And I'll wager it's one of your precious villagers who did it. Get me a list of everyone who had a grudge against the deceased." "That would be the entire village." "Sir," Hamish said. Before Blair could respond, a soft voice spoke from the edge of the scene. "Chief Inspector, I've brought coffee." Mary Sutherland stood there with a large thermos and a stack of cups. She looked pale and shaken, but her hands were steady as she poured. "Very kind of you, Mrs. Sutherland," Blair said, accepting a cup. He had the sort of nature that could be temporarily mollified by hot beverages and baked goods. "Terrible business, this." "Terrible," Mary agreed softly. "Poor Mr. Thorne. I know he wasn't well liked, but nobody deserves to die like this." She handed Hamish a cup as well, along with a folded piece of paper. "I thought this might be helpful," she said quietly. "It's a list of everyone Mr. Thorne gave legal notices to last night, about the trespassing charges, and I was at the hotel when he handed them out." Hamish unfolded the paper. It was neatly written in Mary's careful hand, with names and details of each confrontation. It was, he thought, almost too helpful. "Thank you, Mrs. Sutherland," he said, meeting her eyes. "This is very thorough." "I try to be observant," she said with a small smile. "It's the librarian in me. We notice details." She distributed the rest of the coffee to the forensics team and then retreated, leaving behind only the faint scent of lavender and the memory of her gentle efficiency. Blair was already studying the list with the expression of a man who had just been handed a menu at an expensive restaurant. "Archie McLean," he read aloud, "threatened with legal action over harbour rights. Now there's a motive. Dr. Brodie, professional misconduct allegations. Another motive. Half the village had reason to want this man dead." "Half the Highlands had reason to want him dead," Hamish said. "That doesn't mean we should start arresting people at random." "I don't do anything at random, Macbeth," Blair snapped. "I do things properly, according to procedure, unlike certain lazy constables who think police work is beneath them." Hamish said nothing. There was no point arguing with Blair when he was in this mood. The man was like a bull with a grievance, and the best thing to do was step aside and let him charge at someone else. The forensics team worked through the morning, photographing, measuring, collecting samples. The fog made everything more difficult, turning the moor into a landscape of shifting shadows and uncertain distances. Hamish walked the perimeter of the scene, looking for anything the others might have missed. He found footprints, several sets, all muddled together. The ground was soft from the mist, and the prints were clear. One set in particular caught his attention. Large Wellington boots, the sort every crofter owned, with a distinctive pattern of wear on the left heel. He photographed them carefully, knowing that Blair would seize on any physical evidence with the enthusiasm of a man who preferred simple answers to complicated questions. By noon, the body had been removed and the scene cleared. Blair departed for Strathbane with promises of swift justice and dire warnings about interfering with official police work. The forensics team followed, carrying their samples and their equipment. Hamish remained behind, standing by the ancient stone looking out across the moor. Somewhere in this landscape of rock and heather, someone had committed murder. Someone who knew the land, who had access to the library's heritage collection, who had the strength to wield a heavy iron tool, and the cold calculation to strike a killing blow. The fog pressed close, and Hamish felt the weight of it, the way it muffled sound and thought alike. This was not going to be a simple case. Nothing about it felt simple. He walked back to the village slowly, lugs at his heels, his mind turning over the details, the body, the weapon, the timing, the location, the helpful Mrs. Sutherland with her coffee and her lists. Something about it all felt wrong, like a piece of music played slightly off-key. By the time he reached the police station, he had made his decision. Blair would pursue his own investigation. Loud and official and probably wrong. Hamish would pursue his own, quiet and unofficial and with any luck, right. It was, after all, what he did best. Chapter 3. Sifting the Highland Gossip. The trouble with official investigations, Hamish reflected as he fed Sonsie her breakfast of fresh haddock, was that they tended to stampede over the truth like a herd of frightened cattle. Blair would charge in with his questions and his accusations, and the villagers would close ranks like a Highland regiment under fire. Nobody would tell him anything useful, but they would tell Hamish, eventually. He started, as he usually did, with the Curry sisters. Nessie and Jessie lived in a neat cottage on the edge of the village, a house so aggressively tidy that dust motes probably apologised before entering. The twins were in their 70s, identical in appearance and nearly identical in speech, with Jessie having the unfortunate habit of repeating everything her sister said. "Constable Macbeth," Nessie said, opening the door. "We've been expecting you." "Expecting you," echoed Jessie. "Have you now?" Hamish removed his cap politely. "And why would that be?" "A murder in Lochdew," Nessie said, with the sort of satisfaction that suggested she had been predicting disaster for years and was now vindicated. "Of course you'd come to us. We see everything." "See everything," Jessie confirmed. They ushered him into their parlour, a room dominated by lace doilies and disapproval. Tea was produced, along with shortbread that tasted of duty rather than pleasure. "Now then," Hamish said, settling into a chair that seemed designed to prevent comfortable sitting. "What can you tell me about Magnus Thorn?" "A dreadful man," Nessie said promptly. "Loud and rude and English." "English," Jessie agreed. As if this explained everything. "Did you see him arguing with anyone in particular?" The sisters exchanged glances, a silent conversation that Hamish had learned to recognise as the preliminary to useful information. "There was a young man," Nessie said slowly, "down by the harbour. Yesterday afternoon it was, before all the unpleasantness at the hotel." "Before the unpleasantness," Jessie confirmed. "What sort of young man?" 30 or so, Nessie said. "City clothes, expensive ones, but not well cared for. He looked worried." "Worried," said Jessie. "And they were arguing?" "Oh yes," Nessie said. "We couldn't hear what about, mind you. We weren't eavesdropping." "Weren't eavesdropping," Jessie said virtuously. Hamish made a note. A worried young man in expensive clothes having an argument with Thorn. That was worth following up. "Did you see where this young man went?" "Into the hotel," Nessie said. "He came out again later after Mr. Thorn did. Drove off in a fancy car." "Fancy car," Jessie said with disapproval. Foreign vehicles were clearly another mark against the mysterious stranger. Hamish finished his tea and made his escape, promising to keep them informed of developments. The sisters waved from their doorstep, two guardians of propriety in a world that was becoming increasingly improper. His next stop was less official and considerably less respectable. Angus MacDonald lived in a caravan on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by chickens and superstition in roughly equal measure. He claimed to have the second sight. a gift that Hamish privately considered to be nothing more than an excellent memory and a talent for listening to gossip. Nevertheless, Angus had his uses. The old man was sitting outside his caravan, smoking a pipe, and looking like a wizard who had fallen on hard times. His beard was long and unkempt, his clothes were held together by hope and string, and his eyes were sharp as broken glass. "I've been expecting you, Hamish Macbeth," he said in Gaelic. "I'm sure you have," Hamish replied in the same language. "What do the spirits tell you about Magnus Thorne's death?" "The spirits tell me he was a bad man who met a bad end," Angus said. "But you don't need spirits to know that. You need alibis and evidence and all the dull machinery of the law, so you can't help me." "I didn't say that." Angus relit his pipe, taking his time about it. "I said the spirits can't help you, but my ears can, and my ears tell me there's more strangers in Loch-Dubh than just the dead man." "The young man at the harbour?" "Aye, him. Staying at the hotel under a false name, or so I'm told. Claims to be a salesman, but he's got the hands of someone who's never done an honest day's work in his life." Hamish raised an eyebrow. "How would you know about his hands?" "I wouldn't," Angus said with a gap-toothed grin. "But Mrs. Wellington saw him at breakfast, and she mentioned it to Mrs. McLean, who mentioned it to her husband, who mentioned it to me when he came asking about the fishing." This was how information travelled in Loch-Dubh. Not in straight lines, but in complicated spirals, and filtered through opinion and observation until it was impossible to separate fact from speculation. "Anything else?" "Dr. Brodie was out on the moor last night," Angus said. "Long after decent folks were in bed. I saw his torch from here." Hamish filed that away as well. Dr. Brodie was not a man given to midnight rambles. Whatever had taken him out in the fog must have been urgent. He left Angus to his pipe and his chickens and headed back toward the village. The afternoon was wearing on, and the fog showed no signs of lifting. It wrapped around Loch-Dubh like a shroud, turning familiar streets strange and muffling the sound of footsteps. His final stop of the day was the Loch-Dubh Hotel, where he found Jimmy Anderson at the bar, nursing a whisky and looking like a man who wished he were anywhere else. "Jimmy," Hamish said, sliding onto the stool beside him, "you look like you could use another—" "I could use a new job," Jimmy said glumly. "Blair's got a bee in his bonnet about this case. Wants it solved by tomorrow so he can get his name in the papers." "Does he now?" Hamish signalled the barman and ordered 2 drams. "And how's he planning to manage that miracle?" "By arresting someone, anyone, and worrying about the evidence later." Jimmy accepted the whisky gratefully. "He's got his eye on that fisherman, Archie something." "Archie McLean," Hamish said. "On what grounds?" "Boot prints at the scene match his wellies, plus he had a public argument with the victim about harbour rights." Jimmy took a long swallow of whisky. "Blair reckons that's motive and opportunity all wrapped up in a neat package." "And what do you reckon?" Jimmy sighed. "I reckon half the men in Sutherland own the same boots and half of them had reason to want Thorne dead. But try telling that to Blair when he's decided he's got his man." Hamish let Jimmy talk, refilling his glass at strategic intervals. By the time the detective inspector had reached the bottom of his 3rd whisky, Hamish had learned several useful things. The autopsy would confirm cause of death as blunt force trauma. The time of death was estimated between 10 at night and 2 in the morning. And Blair had no actual evidence beyond the boot prints and a general desire to arrest someone from Loch-Dubh. "There's one other thing," Jimmy said, his words slightly blurred at the edges. "The forensics team found something odd on the murder weapon. Some kind of glue or adhesive, and not the sort of thing you'd expect on an old farming tool." "What sort of glue?" "Specialised stuff. Archival quality, they said. The kind museums use for preserving old documents." Hamish felt something click into place in his mind, though he could not yet see the full picture. "That is odd," he said mildly. "Isn't it just?" Jimmy agreed. He stood up, swaying slightly. "I'd better get back before Blair notices I'm gone. Thanks for the whisky, Hamish." "Any time, Jimmy." Hamish watched him go, then sat for a while longer, nursing his own drink and thinking. A young man with expensive clothes and worried eyes. Dr. Brodie walking the moor at midnight. Boot prints that could belong to anyone. and archival glue on a murder weapon taken from the Heritage Centre. The pieces were there. He just needed to see how they fitted together. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, and somewhere in its depths a killer was walking free. Chapter 4, The Blackmailer's Ledger. The next morning brought no relief from the fog, but it did bring the official autopsy report. Jimmy Anderson delivered it personally, looking even more haggard than usual. "Blair's on the warpath," he said, accepting a cup of strong tea in Hamish's kitchen. The autopsy confirms a single blow from behind, delivered with considerable force. Death would have been instantaneous. "Small mercies," Hamish said. "Aye, well, Blair's not interested in mercies, small or otherwise. He's got Archie McLean coming in for questioning this afternoon." Hamish frowned. "On what evidence?" "The boot prints, and the fact that Archie was heard threatening to knock Thorne's head off at the pub." Jimmy rubbed his eyes. "It's thin, I know, but Blair's convinced." After Jimmy left, Hamish sat at his desk and studied the photographs he had taken at the crime scene. Something was bothering him, some detail that did not quite fit. The body had been lying face down, the back of the skull crushed. The tush car had been placed neatly beside it, almost ceremonially. That was wrong. If someone had struck in anger in the heat of the moment, they would have dropped the weapon and run. They would not have set it down so carefully. This had been planned. He needed to search Thorne's cottage. The rental property stood at the edge of the village, a converted croft that had been modernised for wealthy tourists who wanted to experience Highland life without sacrificing any actual comfort. Hamish had a spare key, kept for emergencies, and he reasoned that murder constituted a reasonable emergency. The cottage was exactly what he expected. Expensive luggage, expensive clothes, expensive whiskey on the sideboard. Thorne had not believed in doing things by halves. Hamish searched systematically, working through drawers and cupboards with the methodical patience of a man who knew that clues rarely announce themselves. He found business cards, receipts, a laptop that would require technical expertise he did not possess. Nothing obviously incriminating. Then he found the safe. It was hidden behind a painting of a Highland stag, which Hamish considered rather unimaginative. The safe was a small, modern affair with an electronic lock. Hamish stared at it for a moment, then tried the most obvious combination: Thorne's birth date, which he had noted from the man's driving licence. The safe opened. Inside was a leather-bound ledger and a stack of documents. Hamish pulled them out carefully and spread them on the desk. What he found made his blood run cold. The ledger was a record of blackmail, meticulous and damning. Thorne had not simply been a sporting agent. He had been using his access to old land registry records, estate archives and legal documents to dig up secrets about the families of Lochdoub, and then he had used those secrets to force them into signing away their hunting rights for ridiculous sums. Archie McLean was there. Thorne had discovered that Archie's grandfather had never properly registered the deeds to his harbour shed, making it technically the property of the estate. Thorne had been threatening to evict him unless he paid an extortionate usage fee. Dr. Brodie was there too. A medical mistake from 20 years ago, one that had been quietly settled and never reported to the board. Thorne had found the records and was threatening to resurrect the case unless the doctor signed over his family's traditional hunting grounds. Page after page of calculated cruelty, each entry listing a name, a secret, and an amount of money extorted or land seized. Hamish photographed every page with his mobile, his disgust growing with each revelation. No wonder half the village had wanted Thorne dead. The man had been a parasite, feeding on other people's misfortunes. He was replacing the ledger when he heard the front door open. "Constable Macbeth?" called a soft voice. "Are you here?" Hamish swore silently. He closed the safe, straightened the painting, and stepped out of the bedroom to find Mary Sutherland standing in the hallway, a basket over her arm. "Mrs. Sutherland," he said, keeping his voice neutral, "what brings you here?" "I thought someone should tidy up," she said, looking apologetic. "The cottage will need to be returned to the rental agency, and with Mr. Thorne's family not yet contacted, I thought it was the least I could do. It was, Hamish thought, perfectly in character. Mary was always doing the least she could do, which invariably turned out to be a great deal. Very thoughtful, he said. I was just having a look round myself. Police business? Of course. She set down her basket. Have you found anything helpful? Nothing conclusive, Hamish lied smoothly. The ledger was evidence, and evidence needed to be processed properly. Not discussed with helpful librarians. Just trying to get a sense of the man. He wasn't a good man, Mary said quietly. I know we shouldn't speak ill of the dead, but he was cruel. He enjoyed hurting people. Did he hurt you? She looked startled. Me? Oh no, Constable. I'm nobody important. Just the village librarian. He had no interest in me. But her hands, Hamish noticed, were gripping the basket handle rather tightly. Well, I'll leave you to your tidying, he said. I need to get back to the station. He walked back through the fog, his mind turning over what he'd learned. The ledger explained the motives well enough. Half the village had been under Thorne's thumb. Any one of them might have snapped. But it did not explain the archival glue, back at the station. He made copies of the photographs and filed them carefully. Then he sat down with a notepad and began listing what he knew. Magnus Thorne had been killed between 10 at night and 2 in the morning. The weapon was a cast-iron tushkar from the Heritage Centre's display. The killer had navigated the dark moor without a light, suggesting local knowledge. Archie MacLean's boot prints were at the scene, but so were several other sets, too muddled to identify clearly. And then there was the glue. Archival quality adhesive, the sort used for preserving old documents, the sort a librarian would use. Hamish tapped his pen against the paper. Mary Sutherland had been remarkably helpful throughout this investigation. She had appeared with coffee and lists. She had volunteered information about Thorne's confrontations. She had shown up at the cottage ready to tidy and organise. Too helpful, perhaps. He thought about the standing stone where Thorne's body had been found. It marked the crossroads of the old Drove Road, the very land Thorne had been trying to commercialise. A symbolic location, if one wanted to make a point. The telephone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Hamish, it's Jimmy. The detective inspector sounded harried. Blair's just arrested Archie MacLean. He's charging him with murder. On what grounds? The boot prints and the threat, and the fact that Archie has no alibi for the night in question. Says he was at home in bed, but his wife wasn't there to confirm it. Where was his wife? Visiting her sister in Brakey. She does that sometimes when she and Archie have had a row. Which Hamish knew, as this was approximately once a week. The MacLeans had a marriage based on the principle of strategic separation. Jimmy, Archie didn't do this. I know that, and you know that, but try telling Blair. He's already called a press conference. Hamish hung up and sat staring at the wall. Blair would get his arrest and his headlines, and an innocent man would be charged with murder while the real killer walked free, unless Hamish could prove otherwise. He looked down at his notes, at the list of suspects and motives and means. Somewhere in this tangle of information was the truth, waiting to be teased out. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and grey and impenetrable. But fog, Hamish knew, always lifted eventually, and when it did, everything hidden would be revealed. He just needed to make sure he was looking in the right direction when that happened. Chapter 5. Expanding the suspect pool. The arrest of Archie MacLean caused exactly the sort of uproar Hamish had anticipated. By noon, half the village had descended upon the police station, demanding explanations, justice, and in the case of Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, a strongly worded letter to the Scottish Parliament. Archie MacLean wouldn't hurt a fly, she declared, her substantial bosom heaving with indignation. This is persecution, pure and simple. I quite agree, Hamish said, but I'm not the one doing the persecuting. Then you should stop it, Mrs. Wellington said firmly. You're the police. I'm a police constable, Hamish corrected gently. Detective Chief Inspector Blair outranks me by several levels. I can't simply order him to release a prisoner. Then what good are you? It was a fair question, and one Hamish had been asking himself for most of the morning. The crowd eventually dispersed, muttering darkly about justice and Blair and the general incompetence of officers from Strathbane. Hamish retreated to his kitchen, made himself a strong cup of tea, and tried to think. The problem was not proving Archie innocent. The problem was proving someone else guilty, and for that, he needed to understand all the players in this particular game. He pulled out the photographs of Thorne's ledger and began going through them systematically. 3 names stood out as having both motive and means. Archie McLean was first, but Hamish could eliminate him on principle. The fishman was many things: argumentative, stubborn, possessed of a wife who could strip paint with her tongue, but he was not a murderer. Dr. Brodie was second. The medical mistake that Thorne had threatened to expose was serious enough to end the doctor's career. That was a powerful motive, and Dr. Brodie was intelligent enough to plan a murder and strong enough to wield the tushkar. But then there was the matter of the mysterious young man the Curry sisters had seen arguing with Thorne. Hamish needed to identify him. He found his answer at the hotel, where the register revealed a guest who had checked in 2 days before Thorne's death. Mr. C. Vane from Edinburgh. Vane, Hamish said aloud, and felt another piece click into place. He drove to Strathbane that afternoon, navigating the fog-shrouded roads with the careful attention of someone who valued his continued existence. The city rose out of the mist like a grey phantom, all concrete and disappointment. The records office was located in a building that looked like it had been designed by someone who actively hated beauty. Hamish spent an hour digging through birth certificates and marriage licenses before he found what he was looking for. Callum Vane, aged 32, born in Edinburgh. Nephew to Magnus Thorne through his mother's side of the family. The nephew had come to Lochdew. That was interesting. Back in his Land Rover, Hamish telephoned Jimmy Anderson. "I need a favour," he said. "Another one?" Jimmy sighed. "Blair's already suspicious about how much time I spend talking to you. Tell him you're keeping an eye on me, making sure I don't interfere with the investigation." "That's not far from the truth," Jimmy admitted. "What do you need?" "Information about Callum Vane, Thorne's nephew. He's staying at the Lochdew Hotel under his own name, but I'd like to know more about him." There was a pause, then the sound of computer keys clicking. "Right," Jimmy said. "Callum Vane, multiple addresses in Edinburgh, all upscale. No criminal record, but there are several civil judgments against him. Unpaid debts, mostly. Gambling, from the look of it." "How much does he owe?" "Enough to make him very interested in his uncle's estate. We're talking 6 figures, Hamish. The sort of debt that gets people's legs broken if they don't pay up quickly." Hamish thanked Jimmy and rang off. A nephew with gambling debts was a classic motive for murder, especially if said nephew stood to inherit his uncle's considerable wealth. He drove back to Lochdew through the thickening fog, his mind busy with possibilities. By the time he reached the village, evening was falling, and the mist had turned the colour of old pewter. The hotel bar was doing brisk business when Hamish walked in. He spotted Callum Vane immediately, sitting alone at a corner table, nursing a whisky that cost more than most people's weekly grocery bill. He was younger than Hamish had expected, with the sort of good looks that had probably opened doors for him all his life. But there were lines around his eyes now, and his expensive suit needed pressing. He had the hunted expression of a man running out of places to hide. "Mr. Vane," Hamish said, pulling out a chair without waiting for an invitation. "Mind if I join you?" Vane looked up, startled. "Do I know you?" "Police Constable Hamish Macbeth. I'm investigating your uncle's death." "Oh." Vane took a long swallow of his whisky. "Yes, a terrible thing. I still can't quite believe it. When did you arrive in Lochdew?" 2 days ago, before it happened." Vane met his eyes defiantly. "I wanted to talk to Magnus about a business proposition." "What sort of proposition?" "A private matter." Vane signalled the barman for another drink. "Family business." "Your family business is now my business," Hamish said mildly. "Given that your uncle was murdered, and you were in the village when it happened." Vane's hand shook slightly as he reached for his fresh glass. "I didn't kill him. I haven't suggested you did. But I would like to know why you were arguing with him at the harbour. The Curry sisters, I suppose." Vane laughed without humour. "I should have known. This place is like living in a fishbowl." "It has its charms," Hamish said. "What were you arguing about?" For a moment he thought Vane would refuse to answer. Then the younger man slumped in his chair, looking suddenly exhausted. "Money," he said flatly. "What else? I owed some people in Edinburgh, serious people. I asked Magnus for a loan to tide me over, and he refused. He laughed at me." Vane's voice was bitter. Said it would teach me a valuable lesson about fiscal responsibility. He had millions, and he wouldn't spare me £50,000. Said it would be good for my character to face the consequences of my actions. That must have made you angry. Furious. I told him exactly what I thought of him, and his sanctimonious lectures. Vane drained his glass. "But I didn't kill him. I left the harbour, drove back to Edinburgh, and spent the evening getting drunk in my flat. Check the traffic cameras if you don't believe me." "I will," Hamish said. "Where were you between 10 at night and 2 in the morning on the night your uncle died?" "In Edinburgh. Alone, unfortunately, so I can't prove it. But I swear to you, I didn't come back here." Hamish studied him. Vane was either telling the truth or he was an excellent liar. Time would tell which. He left the hotel and walked back toward the police station, passing Dr. Brodie's surgery on the way. On impulse, he stopped and knocked on the door. The doctor answered, looking tired and considerably older than his 60 years. "Hamish, come in." The surgery smelled of antiseptic and old books. Dr. Brodie had been practising in Lockdow for 40 years, delivering babies and treating ailments, and generally serving as the village's medical conscience. I need to ask you about Magnus Thorne," Hamish said. The doctor's expression hardened. "That man was a vulture. He was blackmailing you." "Yes." Dr. Brodie sat down heavily. "I made a mistake 20 years ago, misdiagnosed a patient's symptoms. By the time I realised my error, the condition had progressed beyond treatment. The patient died. The family accepted my apology and a financial settlement. The matter was closed. Until Thorne found out." "Until Thorne found out," the doctor agreed. "He wanted me to sign over my family's hunting rights to his commercial venture. Said if I didn't, he would report me to the medical board. My career would have been over." "Where were you the night he died?" "Playing cards with Reverend Wellington and 2 of the church elders. We meet every Tuesday." "I was there until past midnight." Hamish made a note. "And after midnight?" "I walked home. It's a 5-minute walk from the manse to my house." "Did anyone see you?" "In that fog? I doubt it. But I went straight home, Hamish. I didn't go anywhere near the moor." Hamish believed him. Dr. Brodie was many things, but he was not a killer. Besides, the Reverend would confirm the alibi. The man might bend the truth for a good cause, but he would not commit perjury for a card game. He left the surgery and continued home, where Luggs greeted him with enthusiasm, and Sonsie greeted him with the feline equivalent of a shrug. 3 suspects, all with strong motives. Archie McLean, who was innocent but under arrest. Callum Vane, who had debts and a temper. Dr. Brodie, who had his career to protect. And yet Hamish kept coming back to the archival glue. That was the detail that did not fit with any of them. He fed his animals, made himself a sparse dinner, and sat down with his notes. Somewhere in the tangle of information was the pattern he was looking for. The fog pressed against the windows, and outside the village slept uneasily. Tomorrow he would need to dig deeper, push harder, ask the questions that nobody wanted to answer. But tonight he simply sat and thought, listening to the silence and waiting for the truth to reveal itself. Chapter 6. False Trails and Poached Fish. Hamish woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of Luggs growling. This was unusual. Luggs was not a dog given to nocturnal disturbances, unless something was genuinely amiss. "What is it?" Hamish whispered, pulling on his clothes in the darkness. Luggs padded to the window and pressed his nose against the glass. Hamish joined him and peered out into the fog-shrouded night. At first he saw nothing. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he caught a flicker of movement near the edge of the moor. A torch beam, bobbing and weaving through the mist like a will-o'-the-wisp. Someone was out there. Hamish grabbed his own torch and his jacket and slipped out into the night, leaving lugs behind with strict instructions to guard Sonsey. The fog was even thicker at this hour, a solid wall of dampness that clung to skin and clothing alike. He moved quietly, following the distant light. Years of walking these hills had taught him where to place his feet, how to move without sound. The beam ahead of him was moving in an erratic pattern, as if the person carrying it was searching for something, or burying something. Hamish crept closer, using the fog as cover. The figure resolved itself into a familiar shape. Dr. Brodie, bent over a shallow hole he had dug in the soft earth, lowering something wrapped in burlap. This was it, Hamish thought. The evidence he'd been looking for. Dr. Brodie disposing of something incriminating in the dead of night. He switched on his torch. "Working late, Doctor," he said quietly. Dr. Brodie shot upright with a yelp of alarm, nearly dropping the burlap bundle. In the harsh beam of Hamish's torch, his face was pale and guilty. "Hamish! Good God, you nearly gave me a heart attack." "I could say the same about you sneaking around the moor at 3 a.m. Hamish kept his voice neutral. "What's in the sack?" "Nothing," Dr. Brodie said too quickly. "Just some rubbish I was disposing of." "At 3 a.m? On the moor?" Hamish stepped closer. "I'm going to need to see what's in that sack, Doctor." For a moment he thought the older man might refuse. Then Dr. Brodie's shoulders sagged in defeat. "It's not what you think," he said wearily. "Why don't you let me be the judge of that?" Dr. Brodie opened the sack. Inside, illuminated by the torch beam, was the unmistakable silver-scaled body of a large salmon. Hamish stared at it. Then he started to laugh. "You're poaching," he said. "All this skulking about in the middle of the night and you're burying a poached salmon." "It's not funny," Dr. Brodie said with wounded dignity. "Mrs. Brodie would have my hide if she knew. She's very particular about following the rules. Says it sets a bad example for the village if the doctor is seen to be breaking the law. So you thought you'd bury the evidence?" "I panicked," the doctor admitted. "Young MacLeod gave it to me this afternoon. Said his wife wouldn't cook it because she knew it wasn't caught legally. I thought I could just slip it in the freezer, but Mrs. Brodie was doing an inventory. She's always doing inventories. The woman has an unnatural relationship with lists." Hamish looked at the distinguished village physician, standing in the fog at 3 a.m. with a contraband fish, and felt his suspicions deflate like a punctured balloon. "Go home, Doctor," he said, "and next time young MacLeod offers you something that fell off the back of his boat, tell him no." "What about the salmon?" "I'll deal with it. Now go before someone else sees you." Dr. Brodie fled with the gratitude of a man who'd been expecting handcuffs, and received mercy instead. Hamish picked up the burlap sack and carried it back to the police station, where he deposited it in his own freezer. It would make excellent eating over the next few weeks, and what Mrs. Brodie didn't know would not hurt her. He went back to bed, but sleep eluded him. His mind kept circling back to the investigation, to the pieces that still did not fit. Morning brought no clarity. It was only more fog and a telephone call from Jimmy Anderson. "Traffic cameras confirm Callum Vane's story," Jimmy said. "His car was spotted leaving Lochdoub at 4 p.m. 2 days ago. It doesn't show up again on any cameras near the village until the morning after the murder. Could he have come back on foot? It's a 50-mile drive, Hamish. Even if he parked somewhere and hiked in, the timing doesn't work. The cameras show his car in Edinburgh at 9:30 that evening. He couldn't have made it back to Lochdoub in time." Another suspect eliminated. "What about Dr. Brodie's alibi?" Hamish asked. "Confirmed. Reverend Wellington says the doctor was at cards until midnight, and the Reverend's wife saw him leave. The doctor lives 5 minutes from the manse. Even if he had gone straight to the moor from there, he would have been cutting it fine. And Archie? Blair's still holding him. But the evidence is circumstantial at best, and the Procurator Fiscal is making unhappy noises. We can't hold him much longer without something more substantial." After Jimmy rang off, Hamish sat staring at his notes, 3 prime suspects, all with solid alibis, which meant he was missing something fundamental. He decided to take a different approach. Instead of focusing on the suspects, he would focus on the weapon. The Heritage Centre was housed in an old schoolhouse at the edge of the village. It smelled of lavender and old wood, and the particular mustiness that afflicts all buildings dedicated to preserving the past. Mary Sutherland was at her desk cataloguing what appeared to be a collection of Victorian photographs. She looked up as Hamish entered, her expression welcoming. "Constable Macbeth, how can I help you?" "I wanted to ask about the tush car," Hamish said. "The one that was used to kill Magnus Thorne. How long had it been on display?" "Oh, years," Mary said. "It was donated by the Mackenzie family when old Mrs. Mackenzie passed. It had been in their family since the 1800s, a lovely piece of local history." "Who had access to the display?" "Anyone, really. We're open 3 days a week, and the displays are just behind rope barriers. Anyone could have reached over and taken it." She paused. "Though I would have noticed during my weekly inventory if it had been missing for long." "When do you do your inventories?" "Friday afternoons. I go through each display case and make sure everything is accounted for." "And when did you last see the tush car in its proper place?" Mary consulted a leather-bound logbook. "Friday afternoon, 3 days before Mr. Thorne was killed. It was definitely there then. I make notes of any items that need cleaning or repair, and I specifically noted that the tush car needed its information card updated." "So it was taken sometime between Friday afternoon and the night of the murder?" "It would appear so." Hamish looked around the Heritage Centre. The displays were neatly arranged, each item carefully labelled and positioned. There were old farming tools, photographs of Lochdoub in years past, documents in protective cases. "You use special materials for preservation," he said, keeping his tone casual. "Archival quality supplies. Of course, the climate here is so damp we have to be very careful about deterioration. I use acid-free materials, specialised adhesives, UV protective cases." She gestured to a cabinet behind her desk. "All the proper supplies." "The police found traces of archival adhesive on the murder weapon," Hamish said, watching her carefully. "Any idea how that might have gotten there?" Mary's expression did not change. How strange. Perhaps whoever took it from the display got some on their hands. "I had been working on repairing some old documents that afternoon. The glue does tend to get everywhere when one is not careful." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Too reasonable, perhaps. "Do many people help with the displays?" Hamish asked. "Just myself and occasionally Mrs. Wellington when she's feeling civic-minded. But she hasn't been in for weeks. Her arthritis, you know." Hamish thanked her and left, his mind churning. Mary had opportunity. She had access to both the weapon and the archival materials. But what was her motive? She was not in Thorne's ledger. She had no apparent connection to the man. He walked slowly back through the village, nodding to the few souls brave enough to be out in the fog. The Curry sisters waved from their window. Angus MacDonald's chickens scratched in their pen. Life in Lochdoub continued its gentle rhythm, apparently undisturbed by murder and false arrest. But Hamish knew better. Beneath the surface calm, something was wrong. He could feel it the way sailors feel an approaching storm, a pressure in the air that promised violence. And he needed to look deeper into Mary Sutherland's past. The problem was doing so without alerting her to his suspicions. In a village the size of Lochdoub, secrets were hard to keep, but they were even harder to uncover when everyone was watching. He would need to be clever about this. Fortunately, being clever while appearing lazy was one of Hamish Macbeth's particular talents. The fog rolled on, and somewhere within it, the truth waited to be discovered. Chapter 7. Ironclad Alibis. The problem with investigating someone like Mary Sutherland, Hamish reflected, was that she was so relentlessly helpful that asking questions about her felt rather like kicking a puppy. Nevertheless, puppies sometimes bit, and Hamish had learned long ago that the most dangerous people were often the ones who appeared the least threatening. He began by doing what he did best, appearing to do nothing at all. He spent the morning at the harbour, ostensibly checking fishing licences, but actually talking to the old men who gathered there to smoke and complain about the weather. They were a reliable source of information, these ancient mariners, with memories that stretched back decades and tongues that loosened with the application of tobacco and sympathy. "Mary Sutherland," said old Alistair McPhee, tamping down his pipe. "Aye, she's been here a long while. Quiet woman, keeps herself to herself." "How long has she been in Lochdu?" Hamish asked casually. "Must be 20 years or more. Came after her husband died, or so I heard. Wanted a fresh start away from the memories." "Where was she before?" "Inverness, I think. Or maybe it was Fort William, somewhere south of here anyway." Alistair squinted at the fog. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," Hamish said. "She's been very helpful with the investigation." "That's Mary for you, always ready to lend a hand." Hamish made his way back through the village, stopping at the pub where Archie McLean's wife was holding court. She was a formidable woman, with the build of a Highland bull and the temperament to match. "My Archie wouldn't hurt a fly," she declared, her voice carrying across the bar. "That fat fool from Strathbane has arrested an innocent man, and I'll not stand for it." "Where was Archie the night of the murder?" Hamish asked, though he already knew the answer. Mrs. McLean's expression became evasive. "Home in bed, where any decent man would be at that hour. With you? I was visiting my sister in Brakey. Archie gets under my feet sometimes, and I needed a bit of peace." "So he was alone?" "He was in bed," Mrs. McLean said firmly. "Whether he was alone or not is his own business." Which meant, Hamish thought, that Archie had probably been hiding somewhere to avoid his wife's tongue. The pub cellar was the traditional refuge, and the landlord would confirm it if pressed. Then he found the landlord polishing glasses with the weary patience of a man who had heard every excuse and every lie the human imagination could produce. "Archie was here," the landlord confirmed quietly. "Came in through the back door around 9 o'clock, said his wife was on the warpath. I let him sleep it off in the cellar. He didn't leave until the next morning." "You're certain?" "Aye, I checked on him at midnight when I locked up. He was snoring like a walrus, still there at 7 when I opened up again." Another alibi confirmed. Hamish thanked him and moved on. By afternoon he had verified the movements of every major suspect. Callum Vane had been in Edinburgh, captured on multiple traffic cameras. Dr. Brodie had been playing cards at the manse until after midnight, confirmed by 3 separate witnesses. Archie McLean had been unconscious in the pub cellar, vouched for by a landlord who had no reason to lie, which left him back at the beginning, with nothing but questions and a growing suspicion that the answer was hiding in plain sight. He returned to the police station to find Reverend Wellington waiting on his doorstep. The minister was a kindly man with the unfortunate habit of believing the best of everyone, which made him simultaneously beloved and occasionally ineffective. "Hamish," he said, looking distressed, "I need to speak with you about Dr. Brodie." "What about him?" "I'm worried I may have given him a false alibi." The Reverend twisted his hands together anxiously. "The card game ended at 12:15, as I told the detective inspector. But I've been thinking. Oh, and I'm not entirely certain the doctor couldn't have made it to the moor in time." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I believe in telling the truth, even when it's difficult." The Reverend met his eyes. "If Dr. Brodie killed that man, I cannot protect him with my silence." "Dr. Brodie didn't kill anyone," Hamish said with more certainty than he felt. "But I appreciate your honesty, Reverend." After the minister left, Hamish sat at his desk and forced himself to think systematically. The killer had to have several specific characteristics. They needed intimate knowledge of the moor to navigate it in darkness and fog. They needed access to the Heritage Centre to steal the Tushkar. They needed the physical strength to deliver a killing blow. And most importantly, they needed a motive strong enough to justify murder. And Mary Sutherland fit the first 3 criteria perfectly. She was born and raised in the Highlands. She had unlimited access to the Heritage Centre, and while she appeared frail, Hamish had seen her carry boxes of books that would have strained a younger person. But the motive remained elusive. He pulled out the photographs of Thorne's ledger again and went through them page by page, looking for any mention of Mary or her family. Nothing. No Sutherlands, No references to librarians or heritage societies, no connection at all. Unless she was using a different name. The thought struck Hamish with the force of revelation. Mary Sutherland was a widow. Sutherland was her married name. What had her maiden name been? Or he telephoned the registrar's office in Inverness and spent 20 minutes being transferred from department to department before finally reaching someone who could help. Yes, they had a record of Mary Sutherland's marriage certificate. Yes, they could provide her maiden name. Drummond, the clerk said. Mary Drummond, married to Donald Sutherland in 1978. Hamish felt his pulse quicken. He flipped through the ledger photographs with new urgency, looking for any reference to Drummond. And there it was, on page 17. A notation about a property dispute from 30 years ago. The Drummond family of Lochdoub versus Thorn Holdings Limited, over land containing the old Drove Road. The Drummonds had lost the case, lost their land, and subsequently lost everything. The family had been bankrupted by legal fees and predatory lending. There was a handwritten note in the margin. Father committed suicide. Daughter disappeared. Sweet revenge for the old man. Hamish sat back, his mind racing. Mary had not been in the ledger under her current name because she was part of Thorn's past, not his present. She had been his historical victim, not his current prey. But why had she stayed in Lochdoub? Why had she remained in the very place that had destroyed her family? The answer, when it came, was coldly logical. She had stayed because she was waiting for the chance to reclaim what had been taken from her family, waiting for justice, or revenge, or whatever she chose to call it. He needed to confirm his theory, but he had to be careful. Mary was intelligent and observant. If she suspected he was investigating her, she would become even more guarded. That evening he visited Mrs. Wellington at the manse, bringing a bottle of the minister's favourite whisky as a pretext. "I'm trying to trace some family histories," he said casually, "for a project. Do you remember the Drummond family? They lived here years ago." Mrs. Wellington's face grew sombre. "Oh yes, tragic business that. Angus Drummond was a good man, but he got caught up in a legal dispute over land rights. Some London company claimed his family had been squatting on estate property for generations. The court case dragged on for years and cost him everything. What happened to the family? Angus hanged himself in his barn. His wife died of grief not long after. There was a daughter, but she left the village. I heard she moved to Inverness. Do you remember her name? Mary, I think. Yes, definitely Mary. Sweet girl. Very quiet. She used to help in the library even as a child." Mrs. Wellington paused. I don't think anything yet," Hamish said quickly. "Just gathering information." He left the manse with his theory confirmed and his conscience troubled. Mary had suffered a genuine injustice. Her father had been destroyed by Magnus Thorne's father, and she had spent decades living with that loss. But that did not excuse murder. The fog was lifting at last as Hamish walked home. For the first time in days he could see the stars above Lochdoub, cold and bright and different. The moor stretched out in the darkness, holding its secrets close. Tomorrow he would have to confront Mary with what he knew, but tonight he simply walked and thought about justice and revenge and the long shadows cast by old wrongs. The lugs pressed against his leg, and Hamish reached down to scratch the dog's ears. "Almost there," he murmured. "Almost there." Chapter 8. The Librarian's Flaw. Hamish spent a restless night wrestling with his conscience and his duvet in roughly equal measure. By dawn he had reached a decision. He would give Mary one chance to tell him the truth before he brought down the full weight of the law upon her grey-haired head. It was, he admitted to himself, not the most professional approach. But then again, professionalism had never been his strong suit. The morning brought clear skies for the first time in a week. The fog had finally lifted, revealing Lochdoub in all its austere Highland beauty. The mountains stood sharp against the blue, and the loch sparkled in the pale sunlight like beaten silver. Hamish walked to the Heritage Centre, enjoying the crisp air and the absence of oppressive dampness. He found Mary at her desk, Hunt sorting through a collection of old parish records with the concentrated attention of a scholar at prayer. "Good morning, Constable," she said, looking up with her customary gentle smile. "Isn't it lovely to see the sun again?" "It is indeed, Mrs. Sutherland." Hamish pulled up a chair without being invited. "I was hoping you could help me with something." "Of course. Anything at all." "I'm trying to verify the timeline you gave Detective Chief Inspector Blair. The one about who Magnus Thorne spoke to on the night before he died." "Oh, yes." Mary reached for her notebook. "I made very detailed notes. I thought they might be useful." "They have been," Hamish said. "Very useful indeed. In fact, they've been almost too useful, if you take my meaning." Something flickered in Mary's eyes, gone so quickly Hamish might have imagined it. "I'm afraid I don't understand," she said softly. "You mentioned that Thorne was researching a particular historical deed, the one relating to the Drummond family's land claim." "Did I?" Mary's hand stilled on the notebook. "Aye, you did. But here's the curious thing, Mrs. Sutherland. That deed was destroyed in a fire at the estate office in 1985. There's no way Thorne could have been researching it, because it no longer exists." The silence that followed was profound. Mary sat perfectly still, her face composed, her hands folded neatly on the desk. Only her eyes betrayed her, and they were looking at Hamish with a new assessment, calculating and cold. "Perhaps I was mistaken about which document he was viewing," she said finally. "Perhaps," Hamish agreed. "Or perhaps you wanted to point me toward the land dispute without revealing your own connection to it." "I don't know what you mean. I think you do, Miss Drummond." The use of her maiden name hung in the air between them like an accusation. Mary's composure cracked, just slightly, a hairline fracture in porcelain. "That's not my name any more," she said quietly. But it was. Mary Drummond, daughter of Angus Drummond, who lost his land and his life because of a legal battle with Thorne Holdings Limited. Mary said nothing. She simply looked at him with those calm grey eyes, waiting. "You've been here all along," Hamish continued, "living in the village where your family was destroyed, working in the Heritage Centre, preserving the history that included your own tragedy. Waiting. Waiting for what? Constable? For Magnus Thorne to come back. For the chance to make him pay for what his father did to yours." Mary stood and walked to the window, looking out at the sunlit village. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "My father was a good man. He loved this land, not because it made him rich. It never did. But because it had been in our family for 8 generations. The drove road ran through our property. Every autumn we would watch the cattle come down from the high pastures, hundreds of them, and my father would say it was like watching history itself march past." She turned to face him. "Then Thorne's father found some obscure legal loophole and claimed our family had been trespassing on estate land for over a century. He hired expensive lawyers and buried my father in legal fees. We lost everything. The land, our home, our savings. My father couldn't bear it. He hanged himself in what had been our barn, but was by then owned by strangers." "I'm sorry," Hamish said, and meant it. "Are you? Because you're about to arrest me for murder, aren't you?" "That depends," Hamish said carefully, "on whether you're going to tell me the truth." Mary returned to her desk and sat down with the air of someone settling in for a long conversation. "I came back to Lockdube 20 years ago," she said, "after my husband died and I had nothing left keeping me away. I thought perhaps I could make peace with what had happened. Instead, I found myself becoming the village archivist, the keeper of records, the person who remembered all the old injustices." She opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been documenting the Thorne family's business practices for 2 decades. Every shady land deal, every family they bankrupted, every legal loophole they exploited. I told myself it was historical research, but really I was building a case. Proof of a pattern of predatory behaviour going back 3 generations. And then Magnus Thorne came to Lockdube," Hamish said. "And then Magnus came to Lockdube," Mary echoed. "At first I thought it was just cosmic irony. But then I realised he was planning to do the same thing his father had done, commercialise the drove road, charge people for access to land they'd used freely for centuries, history repeating itself. So you killed him. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Hamish leaned forward. You took the touche car from the display sometime between your Friday inventory and the night of the murder. You knew the moor like the back of your hand because you grew up here. You waited for him near the standing stone, and when he came, you struck him down with a tool that had belonged to families just like yours. Families who worked the land before the Thorns decided to own it. Mary's expression remained serene. That's a very compelling story, Constable. Can you prove any of it? I found something at the crime scene yesterday, Hamish said. It was a lie, but a useful one. A scrap of vellum caught on the handle of the touche car, the same vintage vellum you use for your preservation work, and the archival glue, of course. For the first time, Mary looked uncertain. There's also the note you allegedly found, Hamish continued. The threatening note supposedly written by Archie MacLean. It was too convenient, arriving just when you needed to direct suspicion away from yourself. And I'd wager the handwriting analysis will show it was forged. You've been very thorough, Mary said quietly. It's my job. Your job is also to arrest me. Why haven't you? It was a fair question, and Hamish considered it carefully before answering. Because I'm trying to decide whether justice is better served by seeing you in prison or by understanding why you did what you did. And have you decided? Not yet, Hamish admitted. But I will. Soon. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. One thing I don't understand, he said. The timing. Why wait 20 years? Why kill him now? Mary's smile was sad and bitter. Because he found something. My father, well, before he died, hid some family artifacts on the moor. Small things. Jewellery, letters, photographs. Things he wanted to keep from the creditors. I never knew where he buried them. I searched for years. And Thorn found them. He was having the land surveyed for his commercial venture. His workers discovered the cache. When Thorn realised what it was, he came to me. He knew who I was, you see. He'd done his research too. He told me he'd have my father's grave dug up and the body examined for any other hidden valuables. He said he'd expose the theft publicly and destroy what little remained of my family's reputation. She looked up at Hamish, and for the first time he saw the steel beneath the softness. He was laughing when he told me, just like his father probably laughed when mine lost everything. So yes, Constable Macbeth. I waited 20 years because I was a coward, and when I finally found the courage to act, it wasn't for justice, it was for revenge. The confession hung between them, brutal in its honesty. Thank you for telling me the truth, Hamish said quietly. What happens now? Now, Hamish said. I need to think. He walked out into the clear autumn morning, leaving Mary Sutherland sitting at her desk surrounded by the history she had so carefully preserved, waiting for her own history to be written. Chapter 9. Sins of the Past. Hamish walked the hills for hours, Lugs trotting faithfully at his side. The dog seemed to understand that his master needed silence and space, and for once refrained from chasing rabbits or investigating interesting smells. The problem, Hamish reflected as he climbed toward the standing stone where Magnus Thorn had died, was that understanding why someone committed murder did not make the murder any less criminal. Mary had killed a man. That she had good reason, or at least reason she considered good, was beside the point in the eyes of the law. But the law, Hamish had learned over the years, was not always the same as justice. He stood at the stone and looked out over the land that had caused so much suffering. The drove road stretched into the distance, ancient and enduring, a path worn by centuries of cattle and crofters and the slow march of Highland life. It was hard to imagine men in London offices claiming ownership of something so fundamental, so rooted in the collective memory of the people who lived here. Yet that was exactly what had happened. Twice. His mobile rang, interrupting his contemplation. It was Jimmy Anderson, and he sounded excited. "Hamish, you're not going to believe what we found in Thorn's effects." "Try me." Letters. Dozens of them, going back 30 years. Correspondence between Magnus Thorn and his father about the Drummond case. The old man was coaching the son on how to finish what he'd started. What do you mean, finish it? Apparently, Angus Drummond hid something on the land before he died. Valuable family heirlooms, possibly including some jewellery that had been in the Drummond family for generations. The Thorns have been looking for it ever since. Magnus thought he'd finally found the location. Did he? According to his notes, yes. He'd had the area surveyed and found a sealed metal box buried near the Drove Road. He was planning to excavate it legally and claim the contents as treasure trove on estate property. Hamish felt something cold settle in his stomach. What was in the box? We don't know. It's still there. Blair's getting a warrant to dig it up. After Jimmy rang off, Hamish sat down on the cold stone and tried to piece together the final elements of the story. Mary's father had buried family treasures to keep them from creditors. Magnus Thorne had discovered them and planned to claim them legally while mocking the daughter of the man who had hidden them. And Mary, pushed beyond endurance, had struck back with a peat cutter and 30 years of accumulated rage. It was, in its way, a very Highland tragedy, all passion and old wounds and the weight of history pressing down on the present. He needed to search the crime scene again. There was something he had missed. He was certain of it. The area around the standing stone had been trampled by police and forensics teams, but Hamish had an eye for detail that others lacked. He quartered the ground methodically, looking for anything that seemed out of place. It took him an hour to find it. Caught in a crack in the standing stone itself, almost invisible against the weathered granite, was a tiny scrap of paper. Hamish extracted it carefully with his penknife and examined it in the sunlight. It was a fragment of an old photograph, no bigger than his thumbnail. The image was faded, but he could make out part of a young girl's face and what looked like a man's hand on her shoulder. On the back, in faded ink, were the words, "Erie and Papa, Summer 19. This was what Mary had come for. Not just revenge, but the recovery of her family's memories. The treasures her father had hidden were not valuable in any monetary sense. They were valuable because they were all she had left of a life that had been stolen from her. Hamish pocketed the fragment and continued his search. 20 feet from the stone, hidden beneath a flat rock, he found the disturbed earth where Thorne's workers had uncovered the buried cache. Someone had dug here recently, within the last few days. Someone had taken the box and its contents. Mary, he realised. She had taken back what was hers. He walked back to the village slowly, his mind made up about what he needed to do. It was not the legal thing, perhaps, but it was the right thing, and in Lochdoub that distinction mattered. He found Mary in the Heritage Centre exactly where he had left her. She looked up as he entered, her expression resigned. "Have you come to arrest me, Constable?" "Not yet," Hamish said. He held out the photograph fragment. "I found this at the scene. I think it fell out when you took the box." Mary's hand trembled as she reached for it. She stared at the tiny scrap of memory, and for the first time since Hamish had known her, she wept. "It's all I have left of him," she said through her tears. "My father. He was such a gentle man, Constable. He never hurt anyone. He just wanted to live on the land his family had worked for generations." "I know," Hamish said quietly. "Do you? Do you really?" Mary wiped her eyes. "Can you understand what it's like to watch someone destroy your entire world and then laugh about it?" "I can imagine." Magnus Thorne stood right there. She pointed to the doorway. "Right there in this building, surrounded by the history of families just like mine. And he told me he was going to claim my father's things as his own. He said it was poetic justice. Justice! As if there was anything just about what his family did to mine." She stood and walked to a locked cabinet at the back of the room. From it she withdrew a small metal box, battered and rusted. "This is what my father died protecting," she said. Opening it, "Look." Inside were the pathetic treasures of a crofter's family. A few pieces of jewellery, not valuable but old. Photographs, letters, a child's drawing, a lock of hair tied with faded ribbon. The accumulated memories of a life lived close to the land and far from wealth. I killed a man for this, Mary said softly. For photographs and letters and a mother's lock of hair. Was it worth it, do you think? That's not for me to judge, Hamish said. But you will judge. You're the law. That's your job. Hamish looked at the box, at the fragments of a destroyed family, and made his decision. Did you plan to kill Magnus Thorne? He asked. No, Mary said. I went to the stone to confront him, to beg him to leave the box alone. He was there, gloating over his find. He said terrible things about my father. Called him a thief and a coward. I saw the Tushkar lying there. He'd brought it to pry open the box, and I didn't think. I picked it up and I hit him. Once. He fell. I didn't check to see if he was breathing. I just took the box and left. You placed the Tushkar beside the body? Yes. I don't know why. Perhaps I wanted it to look deliberate. Perhaps I was trying to make it mean something. She met his eyes. What happens now? Now, Hamish said carefully, you're going to put that box back in the cabinet and lock it. And tomorrow morning, you're going to give yourself up to Detective Chief Inspector Blair. Why tomorrow? Why not now? Because I need time to arrange certain things, to make sure the evidence is presented properly. Mary studied him with those calm grey eyes. Yeah, you're going to help me. I'm going to make sure justice is done, Hamish corrected. There's a difference. After he left the Heritage Centre, Hamish made several telephone calls. The first was to a solicitor in Inverness who specialised in cases involving historical property disputes. The second was to Jimmy Anderson. Jimmy, I need you to do something for me, off the record. How far off the record? Far enough that Blair can't trace it back to you. There was a pause, then a sigh. What do you need? I need you to make sure certain documents in Thorne's effects get into the official evidence file. Letters detailing the predatory practices of Thorne Holdings, the ledger showing his blackmail schemes, everything that proves Magnus Thorne was not an innocent victim. That's playing with fire, Hamish. I know. But it's the only way to ensure Mary gets a fair trial. With the right barrister and the right evidence, this could be argued down to manslaughter. Possibly even justifiable homicide, given the provocation. And if it doesn't work? Then she'll go to prison, Hamish said quietly. But at least she'll go knowing someone tried to balance the scales. That night, Hamish sat in his kitchen with Lugs at his feet and Sonsi in his lap, and thought about justice and revenge and the long shadow of old crimes. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant and unconcerned with human notions of right and wrong. Tomorrow, he would begin the delicate work of ensuring that Mary Sutherland faced consequences for her actions, while also ensuring the world knew why she'd acted. It would not save her from prison, but it might save her from being seen as a monster. In Lockdube, that mattered. Memory mattered. Truth mattered. Even when the truth was uncomfortable and the memory was painful. The law would have its due, but so would history. Chapter 10. The Lazy Constable's Justice. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the sort of autumn day that made the Highlands look like something from a painting. Hamish fed his animals, made himself a proper breakfast of eggs and black pudding, and prepared for what would be a very delicate performance. Blair arrived at the police station at 9 o'clock sharp, looking pleased with himself. This was never a good sign. Macbeth, he announced, bursting through the door without knocking. I'm releasing Archie McLean. The Procurator Fiscal says we don't have enough evidence to hold him. That's good news, Hamish said mildly. I never thought Archie was your man. Of course you didn't, Blair said sourly. You never think anyone's guilty. Too soft, that's your problem. Too worried about hurting people's feelings to do proper police work, Hamish said nothing. There was no point arguing with Blair when he was in this mood. However, Blair continued, his small eyes gleaming, I have received new information. Anonymous tip, mind you, but very detailed. Seems our Mrs. Sutherland isn't who she claims to be. Is that so? Hamish asked, his tone carefully neutral. Aye. Real name's Mary Drummond. Her family had a dispute with the Thorne family 30 years ago. Lost everything. Father killed himself. That's motive, Macbeth. Strong motive. You'll be wanting to question her then? I will. and I expect to make an arrest." Blair puffed out his chest like a pigeon who had just discovered a particularly fine breadcrumb. "This is what proper detective work looks like, Macbeth. Following leads. Connecting dots. Not sitting around drinking tea and hoping criminals confess out of the goodness of their hearts." Before Hamish could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. Mary Sutherland stood on the threshold, dressed neatly in a grey wool coat, carrying a small overnight bag. "Detective Chief Inspector Blair," she said quietly. "I've come to confess to the murder of Magnus Thorne." The silence that followed was spectacular. Blair's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Hamish stood and pulled out a chair for Mary, who sat down with the calm dignity of someone who had made peace with her fate. "Mrs. Sutherland," Blair finally managed, "what are you saying?" "I'm saying I killed Magnus Thorne. I struck him with the Tushkar from the Heritage Centre. It was not premeditated. I went to speak with him and we argued. I lost control. I've come to turn myself in." Blair looked at Hamish suspiciously. "Did you put her up to this?" "I did not," Hamish said truthfully. He had simply told Mary to turn herself in. What she chose to say was her own business. "I'll need to take your statement," Blair said, recovering some of his composure. "Official channels, properly recorded." "Of course," Mary said. "I have certain evidence in my possession that I believe will be relevant to the case. Documentation of Mr. Thorne's blackmail activities, letters detailing his family's business practices. I kept very thorough records." Hamish hid a smile. Mary was many things, but she was not a fool. She understood that the more evidence Blair had of Thorne's character, the better her chances of a sympathetic jury. Blair took Mary to Strathbane for formal questioning, looking simultaneously triumphant at solving the case, and annoyed that the solution had presented itself so easily. Hamish followed in his own vehicle, ostensibly to provide support, but actually to make sure certain documents made it into the official evidence file. Jimmy Anderson met him in the corridor outside the interview room. "I did what you asked," Jimmy said quietly. "The ledger's in the evidence file. So are the letters about the Drummond case. Blair thinks they were in Thorne's effects all along." "Good man. Is she really guilty, Hamish?" "Aye, she killed him." "But the circumstances matter, Jimmy. They always matter." Inside the interview room, Blair was conducting his interrogation with all the subtlety of a bull in a china shop. Hamish watched through the one-way glass as Mary answered questions with calm precision, neither embellishing nor minimising her actions. "So you admit you struck him with the Tushkar?" Blair was saying. "Yes." "And you knew this would likely kill him?" "I didn't think at all. He was saying terrible things about my father. He was laughing about how his family had destroyed mine. I picked up the tool and I hit him. Once. He fell. I left." "And took the buried artefacts?" "I took what was rightfully mine. My father's personal effects. Things that had no monetary value but were precious to my family." Blair leaned back, looking satisfied. "You realise this is a confession to murder?" "I realise," Mary said quietly, "that I killed a man. Whether that's murder or something else is for the courts to decide." The interview continued for another hour. By the end of it, Blair had his confession, his evidence, and his headlines. He emerged from the room looking like a man who had just won the lottery. "Open and shut case, Macbeth," he crowed. "She's confessed to everything. The Procurator Fiscal will have her charged by tomorrow. I'll be holding a press conference this afternoon." "Congratulations, sir," Hamish said. "You've solved a very difficult case." "Aye, well, it takes proper detective work. Experience. Not something you'd understand, being stuck out in that backwater playing at being a policeman." Hamish accepted the insult with his usual equanimity. Blair needed to believe he had solved the case through his own brilliance. It was essential to Hamish's plan that Blair took all the credit. Because if Blair took the credit, then Hamish could not be blamed for the outcome. And if Hamish could not be blamed, then he would not be promoted. And if he was not promoted, he could stay in Lochdub. It was, he reflected, a very roundabout way of preserving his peaceful life. But it was effective. The press conference that afternoon was everything Hamish had expected. Blair stood before the cameras, resplendent in his best suit, and described in exhaustive detail how his brilliant detective work had led to the arrest of Mary Sutherland. He mentioned the anonymous tip, the careful investigation, the meticulous gathering of evidence. He did not mention Hamish at all, except to note that the local constable had been adequately supportive in a minor capacity. Hamish, watching from the back of the room, was delighted. That evening he returned to Lochdoub and found the village in a state of subdued shock. The news had spread, as news always did, and opinion was divided between those who thought Mary had done right and those who thought violence was never justified. Reverend Wellington captured the general mood when he said, "We must pray for Mrs. Sutherland, and for the soul of Magnus Thorne, and for understanding, which is the hardest prayer of all." Hamish made his way home through streets he knew as well as his own heartbeat. He fed Lugs and Sonsie, poured himself a dram of whisky, and sat in his armchair watching the evening settle over the loch. There would be a trial, of course. Now Mary would face justice for what she had done, but the evidence Hamish had carefully ensured made it into the record would show why she had done it. A good barrister could argue provocation, diminished responsibility, years of emotional trauma from her family's destruction. She would likely serve time, but perhaps not as much as she might have, had the full story not been told. It was not perfect justice, but then again, justice never was. The telephone rang, interrupting his contemplation. It was the superintendent from Strathbane. "Constable Macbeth, I'm calling to inform you that in light of Detective Chief Inspector Blair's successful resolution of this high-profile case, we've decided he should remain in his current position. The promotion we discussed for you will be delayed indefinitely." "I understand, sir," Hamish said, fighting to keep the satisfaction out of his voice. "Blair feels you lack the initiative necessary for advancement, says you're too content with your quiet posting, too lazy to pursue proper detective work." "The Chief Inspector knows me well, sir." "Indeed. Well, carry on, Macbeth. Continue your good work in Lochdoub." Hamish hung up and allowed himself a small smile. He had solved the murder, ensured the killer faced justice, protected an innocent man from false arrest, and avoided a promotion to Strathbane all in one elegant manoeuvre. It was, he thought, a very good day's work for a lazy constable. Outside, the stars came out one by one, sharp and cold in the Highland sky. The loch lay still as glass. The village settled into its evening rhythms, everyone safe in their homes, the drama of the day receding into memory. Hamish reached down and scratched Lugs behind the ears. Sonsie stretched luxuriously across his lap, purring like distant thunder. "Well then," he said to his animals, "that's that sorted. Time for a piece of shortbread, I think." He went to the kitchen and cut himself a generous slice from the tin Mrs. Wellington had brought round the previous week. Lugs received a corner, as was only fair. Sonsie, being a cat, expressed disdain for such pedestrian fare and demanded salmon instead. Hamish obliged, cutting a piece from Dr. Brodie's poached fish, now neatly filleted and frozen for future consumption. Outside, the autumn night deepened. The hunt was over. The murder was solved. The delicate balance of life in Lochdoub had been restored, and Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, tall and lazy and content, was exactly where he wanted to be. Home.